getting on the train. Okay, so Gabriel Garcia Marquez died in 2014. If he were alive today, maybe I was somehow in touch with him. Maybe this is it. Maybe I've somehow channeled Garcia Marquez, because I thought I'm going to write a story. And the story came. So, this is the story, and I think this is wonderfully magically realist. It has all those fantastical elements, but within reality. So it's about a beautiful, windswept archipelago off the coast of a continent whose seafaring culture stretched back to when the ancestors learned agriculture and raised complex calendar temples to the starry gods in circles, avenues, and chambered mounds out of stone. Now, in the present, the people were already suspicious of the rulers, since the previous lot had formed a pact with the empire and had launched a war in foreign lands, in which they openly employed torture, kidnapped, incarceration without trial or sentence. Now, the new rulers had to pay for this costly war, but because they had all enthusiastically supported it, they instead blamed the people. And so they embarked on a vigorous campaign of brutal cuts to public services and institutions. They were warned, I can see you're starting to get the picture. They were warned by wise men and women that wrecking the infrastructure of the land would not repay the debt. That the best way to repay the debt would be to force the rich to pay the taxes. But the rich didn't want to pay the taxes. And so the new party pushed even harder, as it soon became clear that they had no interest in paying off any debt, that the creed they swore by was that of selling off the state assets to their rich friends and sponsors. Now, despite these extremes, the party was threatened by a group of far-right thugs headed by a banker, self-styled man of the people, with his cigarette and his beer, who understood and was understood by the working man. And so a golden opportunity presented itself. Let the nation feel that they have some power. Give them a vote. And so the people were called to the palace. You shall have a vote, they were told. Rejoice! On what? On whether this proud nation remains in the alliance of states on the continent. Really? Said the people. And they went home, scratching their heads. Many knew very little about this alliance of powers on the continent, and those who did really had only good things to say. Yes, there were problems, but those problems are part of a global trend, and anyway, surely better to deal with those problems from within the alliance. And many of them didn't think much about it, safe in the knowledge that people wouldn't vote against membership of this alliance. But the hombre del pueblo, with his beer and tobacco, was thick as thieves with some unscrupulous thieves and gangsters, who immediately launched a devastating campaign of propaganda. How the money flowed. Untouchable, unaccountable. Now, in those days, in those distant days, people had this extraordinary habit of spending their days and nights staring at machines. These machines told them things. They could even buy things on these machines. And the merchants had for some years developed programs for making judgments about a person so as to send them targeted adverts. And it worked amazingly well. People were buying shit all the time. Stuff they didn't need or want. Ha-ha, said this gang of gangsters. We'll use this technology to sell them politics. Now, the people were angry. They were angry they were working harder, earning less, paying more taxes, and getting less in return. So these gangsters told them it was all because the nation paid so much to this continental alliance, that the nation was forced to allow too many foreigners in, taking up hospital beds and school places, draining the public purse. That this proud nation was not sovereign or independent, that it was run by nameless, faceless bureaucrats. And they drew on the national pride of the war of 60 years before against some members of this continental alliance. It's happening again, they said, but this time by stealth. Now is your time to be a hero. Be a hero your grandchildren will look up to. And so the vote took place, and they squeezed through on the slimmest of majorities. The victors were quite surprised and were exultant, claiming independence, sovereignty and freedom. They immediately admitted shamelessly to some of the shameless lies and banished the experts. The popular press enthusiastically cheered this victory, urging the people to be angry at the traitors in their midst, at the other voters and at the foreigners. Well, the former leader took his 30 shillings and left the palace for comfortable exile, and handed power to his Minister for Home Affairs, who had for years loyally followed party doctrine, locking up suspected foreigners, deporting citizens of her own country to countries they had never been to. And earlier that year, the year of this popular vote, against all expert advice, passing an authoritarian and utterly insane law criminalising all substances that alter consciousness, aside from those toxic ones approved and taxed by the state. She was the perfect choice. But the honeymoon was short-lived. In order to maintain the story, the leaders and the press ramped up the rhetoric, and more people started to see through it. Little could be agreed on, because it became clear to all that the promises of the campaign were lies. The nation was very closely entwined in the alliance on the continent, in every level. The people already hit by austerity would be hit harder. Meanwhile, the architects of the crisis were making money and making provisions. Now, the first negotiations on the continent by self-styled non-experts arrived at meetings proudly with no notes. Party loyalty was privileged over national interest. Xenophobia flowed in the streets. People were afraid to speak in any language other than the national language. There was a nationwide dismissal of the 48% who had voted in the popular vote. The will of the people was evoked as heavenly law. Strategic dithering persisted for months. Investigations into fraud in that popular vote escalated, and in response the vote was declared to have been from the beginning advisory. Meanwhile, the leaders continued to deport people, continued to lock up protesters against fracking, continued to lock up protesters against deportation, all the while with no plan. Because it wasn't working so well, the leader decided to call a general election, and in so doing lost more support, and so ramped up even more the rhetoric. And 2 years after the popular vote, a withdrawal agreement named loftily as Chequers was roundly rejected by MPs and cabinet members. Months later, I can now call her the Prime Minister, returns from Brussels. I'm getting less fantastical and more concrete here. Months later, the Prime Minister returns from Brussels with a newly written withdrawal agreement. And the government is held in contempt by the Speaker of Commons as the Attorney General refuses to release legal warnings on the impact of this withdrawal agreement. And the meaningful vote in the Commons is pulled at the last minute and delayed until after Christmas. And when it is finally voted on, it suffers a historical defeat in Commons. A defeat like no other vote has ever been defeated on in Commons. No majority whatsoever. And the withdrawal agreement is then brought back a few weeks later. This time, the only change being the margins of the pages have been slightly enlarged to make the document look bigger. And I swear that's true. Right? And the Attorney General reluctantly agrees that there's no change. And guess what? It's rejected again. And the Prime Minister threatens it for the third time. All the while dismissing the calls to allow people to have a second vote, let alone a third vote. This time the Speaker of the House warns that he won't allow a third vote unless the withdrawal agreement is significantly changed. But in order to have the withdrawal agreement significantly changed, it would need to be ratified by the Continental Alliance, who are no longer prepared to carry on wasting time over this dithering. So the Prime Minister returns to Brussels, tail between legs, once again, to ask for an extension, and is granted an extension only if the vote, the meaningful vote for the third time is passed in Commons, which it won't be. The solution is staring everyone in the face. Revoke Article 50. The Prime Minister then speaks to the nation on Wednesday night, in which she looks straight at the camera and says, "I am on your side." The gall of that. And she says, if that's not bad enough, she says, "Don't trust the politicians. Trust me." Now, this story has no end, because it's ongoing. If Garcia Marquez were to write that story, that would be dismissed as fantasy, as science fiction, as a fairy story. That is too divorced from reality to be considered magical realism. But unfortunately, my friends, it's happening. So there you are. Muchas gracias. You're my first audience for that story, and maybe you'll be my only audience. There we go. And I should have added, sorry, it has a... Meanwhile, whilst all this crap is happening, people are overlooking the real problem. And the real problem is climate and biodiversity. That's what we should be focusing on, not this shit show. There you are. Thank you.
Thanks, William.